Welcome. My name is Jonathan Sarna. I am the director of the Schottenstein Center for Israel Studies here at Brandeis University, and it is a great pleasure to welcome everyone to today's Schottenstein Scholar Seminar entitled A Day of Blood and Valor, Terrorism and Social Tensions in 1970s Israel. Our speaker today is Professor Ori Yehudai. He holds the Saul and Sonia Schottenstein Chair in Israel Studies and is Assistant Professor of History at Ohio State University in Columbus, where they're experiencing very bad weather. Professor Yehudai has taught at Toronto, McGill, NYU, at the Center for Jewish History. His work explores Jewish migration and displacement, the reconstruction of the Jewish world after World War II, and relations between Jews and non-Jews after the Holocaust. He is best known for his book, Leaving Zion, Jewish Emigration from Palestine and Israel after World War II. It was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, but now he's moving a little bit later in chronology, and we are very fortunate that he'll be sharing his research dealing with Palestinian attacks in Israel in the 1970s. Let me remind you that if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat at the bottom of your screen. Our Schottenstein graduate student and fellow, Mika Hackner, will be monitoring the chat today, and in about 35 minutes, she'll appear on the screen and will be reporting and asking your questions. Mika is a fifth-year PhD candidate in politics here at Brandeis, and she's writing a very interesting dissertation on the banning of political parties in democracies, looking comparatively at Israel and in Germany. But for now, we turn to Professor Yehudai, and the floor is yours. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sarna, for this generous introduction and for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, to be part of this seminar, and thank you everyone for joining us. The material that I'll be presenting today comes from a new book project that I recently started. The project focuses on a chapter in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I think deserves a closer look than it has been given so far. This is the period from the Six-Day War of 1967 to the First Lebanon War of 1982. This period saw a large number of Palestinian terrorist attacks against Israeli targets, both in Israel and in other countries. The most known cases are, of course, the attack on Israeli athletes in the Olympic Games in Munich in 1972 and the Entebbe hostage crisis in 1976. Those incidents received a lot of attention, but attacks in Israel have not yet been studied properly, despite their tragic and dramatic impact. Now, there are many different aspects to this story. Israeli military and political reactions in the international arena. In my talk today, I deal with responses within Israel. More specifically, I explore the connection between Palestinian terrorism in the 1970s and social and ethnic divisions within Israel. And I do so by concentrating on 3 terrorist attacks against communities in northern Israel that took place between April and June 1974. The attack on Kibbutz Shamir, on the town of Kiryat Shmona and the town of Maalot, and by comparing the public reactions to the attacks and the discourse that developed in their aftermath. My argument is that despite the prevailing assumption that security threats serve as a social glue holding together a deeply divided Israeli society, Palestinian terrorism in the 1970s in fact accentuated social and ethnic divisions and brought them up to the surface. This is my main argument. And my point of departure in this research was the attack on Shamir, on Kibbutz Shamir, not only because it is largely forgotten and certainly much less known than the attacks on Kiryat Shmona and Maalot in other places, but also because I grew up in Shamir and therefore I have a personal connection to the story. I was familiar with the basic details of the event from a young age. The story was conveyed to us during our on various occasions during our childhood and acquired a mythical status in our collective consciousness. The tragic and heroic features of the story, which will become clear shortly, were captured in the phrase "a day of blood and valor." This was the title of an essay that was published, that appeared in the memorial booklet that the kibbutz published 1 month after the attack. But only recently, I became interested in the broader national ramifications of the attack on Shamir and began research that placed the attack in historical, political context with an emphasis on the comparison between the public discussion that followed the attack on Shamir and on other communities. Before entering this discussion, I would like to provide a brief overview of the events. The terrorist attacks of that period were of course part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but they were also related to internal Palestinian politics. After the 1973 Yom Kippur or October War, the United States and the Soviet Union jointly sponsored peace talks between Israel and Arab countries. This compelled the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, which was the dominant force in the Palestinian arena, to decide whether it wanted to join the diplomatic process or remain committed to the long-standing goal of reclaiming Palestine through armed struggle. Towards the end of 1973, the mainstream PLO leadership started advocating departure from the existing strategy of constant war to liberate the whole of Palestine, and accepted instead the idea of a diplomatic process that would only lead to the liberation of the territories that Israel had occupied in 1967. Several Palestinian groups that opposed this moderate position created the rejectionist front within the PLO. Within the PLO, the leading bodies within this rejectionist front was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command. Those were 2 different organizations, and both of them had played a central role in the Palestinian armed struggle since the late 1960s. Now they fear that the PLO was heading towards direct negotiations with Israel, which might lead to significant Palestinian concessions. In order to undermine this new policy of the new moderate policy of the PLO, the rejectionist groups decided to launch attacks against Israel from South Lebanon. South Lebanon had become the basis for Palestinian military activity since the expulsion of the PLO from Jordan in 1970, actually even a bit earlier, since the late 1969. Now let me start sharing my screen. So on April 11th, 1974, 3 militants of one of those groups broke into 2 different apartment buildings in Kiryat Shmona. They went from apartment to apartment and shot the residents. They also seized hostages and demanded the release of 100 Palestinians from Palestinian prisoners from jails in Israel, from Israeli jails. Israeli forces stormed into the building and killed the terrorists, but 18 Israelis, including 8 children and 2 soldiers, died in the incident. About 1 month later, on May 15th, 1974, another squad of another organization penetrated Maalot. Maalot is also located close to the Lebanese border, like Kiryat Shmona and Shamir. So another squad penetrated Maalot and took over a local school building, which on that day hosted a group of high school students on a trip from the nearby town of Sfat. Even before seizing the school building, the squad had killed 3 people in and near Maalot. They held 85 students as hostages in the school building and demanded the release of Palestinian prisoners. The Israeli leadership debated whether to accept the terrorists' demand or use military force to free the hostages. About half an hour before the expiry of the deadline that the terrorists had set for the release of prisoners, the IDF launched a rescue operation. In the course of that operation, it was actually a failed rescue operation. The terrorists killed 21 students before being killed themselves. And then about a month later, on June 13, 1974, came the attack on Shamir. 4 terrorists of the organization that had attacked Maalot penetrated the kibbutz and entered the apiary building. Most apiary workers had gone to breakfast in the kibbutz dining hall, but the terrorists found 2 women who had stayed in the apiary to complete their work, and they killed them on the spot. Then 2 of the 4 terrorists headed towards the kibbutz, and when they reached the area of the children's houses, where children were learning and also living and sleeping, they killed another woman and wounded 1 man. In the meantime, a group of kibbutz members who were finishing their breakfast heard of the attack and formed a small ad hoc fighting force. They rushed to their apartments to grab their rifles. They had their weapons in their apartments in the kibbutz. They located the terrorists and killed them in a shootout near the apiary. Towards the end of the fighting, units of the IDF arrived and took command of the event after the shooting stopped. The militants who attacked Shamir carried leaflets that demanded, like in previous attacks, the release of Palestinian prisoners, but the chain of events in Shamir dictated that the raid did not evolve into a hostage crisis. So, although the political and regional background for the attacks on Shamir, Maalot, and Kiryat Shmona was similar, we see that the unfolding of the events was different. The main difference was that in Shamir, a local force defeated the terrorists without relying on the official security forces. There were other cases in that period, other attacks in that period, where local civilians participated in the fighting, but their actions were less successful and they did not act independently of the army or police. Now, it's important to note that the comparison is somewhat unfair. A kibbutz has a clear advantage over other forms of settlement in dealing with a military attack because it's a very small and highly organized community. But what's more important is how people perceived the differences between what had happened in Shamir, Kiryat Shmona, and Maalot, and how those perceptions were related to the political and social discourse at the time. The conduct of the members of Shamir received many praises. The special government meeting that was dedicated to the events in Shamir, Yitzhak Rabin, who was then in his first tenure as prime minister, and also defense minister Shimon Peres, and the IDF's chief of staff Mordechai Gur, or Moto Gur, all of them commended the courageous and exemplary conduct of Shamir's members against the terrorists. In a visit to Shamir immediately after the attack, Peres said that the courage and decisiveness of Shamir's people and the example they set were the foundations upon Israel's strength rested. Chief of Staff Gur called Shamir's fighters the splendor of Israel. And similar expressions appeared in other reports and reactions. Newspapers in Israel applauded the alertness and fighting skills of Shamir's fighters, and writers of personal letters to members of Shamir depicted their conduct as a model for the entire nation. But there were commentators who did not just praise Shamir's fighters, but also offered implicit and explicit comparisons between the events in Shamir and in other communities that came under terrorist attacks. The renowned poet Chaim Guri wrote in the newspaper the Valor that when he had first heard of the news from Shamir, he thought that this was another version of Kiryat Shmona and Ma'alot. But when more details arrived, he realized that this time things developed differently. Now, I'm quoting from his article in the Valor. This time things developed differently. This time the locals fought. This time they did not stand helpless, waiting to be salvaged by the army, witnessing a massacre as it unfolds. Other observers also noted the difference between what they perceived as the courage and resourcefulness of Shamir's members and the helplessness and panic of residents of other settlements struck by terrorism. Those comparisons had some basis in reality. During the attack on Ma'alot, some of the adults that accompanied the school trip from Tzfat had escaped the school building and left behind them the hostage students. One of the adults who left the school building explained that it was actually the trip leader, the leader of the trip was one of those adults who escaped the building, and he explained that he had left the building in order to bring his rifle, which he had left in his car, which was parking near the school. But in any case, the behavior of some of the adults in Ma'alot received severe public criticism in Israel and obviously did not compare favorably with the conduct of people in Shamir. But even beyond those details, the comparison between Shamir on the one hand and Kiryat Shmona and Ma'alot on the other evoked deeper cultural and social undercurrents, which stemmed from the different status of those communities in Israeli society. Both Kiryat Shmona and Ma'alot originated in the late 1940s and early 1950s as immigrant transit camps. This was the period of the mass immigration during the early years of the state. Later, Kiryat Shmona and Ma'alot evolved into development towns. In the 1960s, Ma'alot was united with the Palestinian Arab village of Tarshiha into a joint Arab Jewish town, and later we will see the significance of that. As many of you know, development towns were small urban centers that Israel established during the Great Emigration. The development towns were established in the northern and southern peripheries of Israel with the aim of populating frontier areas and also dispersing the growing population away from the densely inhabited central areas of the country. Most of the people who were sent to those development towns were immigrants from Muslim countries or Mizrahi Jews, while immigrants from Europe, Ashkenazim, were more likely to be settled in bigger cities or in more central areas. Residents of development towns were isolated from the economic and cultural centers of the country and suffered various forms of economic and social deprivation, that was a part of the larger phenomenon of discrimination against Mizrahi immigrants in that period. While Mizrahim were marginalized by the Zionist nation building project, kibbutzim were considered as the vanguard of the Zionist enterprise. The kibbutzim were established as collective agricultural farms by Jewish immigrants, mainly from Eastern Europe, who were guided by a combination of Zionist and socialist ideals. The kibbutzim became a model of a just and egalitarian society already during the pre-state or Yishuv period, and they embodied the Zionist ethos of return to the soil and self-defense. But already in the 1950s, relations between the largely Ashkenazi kibbutzim and Mizrahi immigrants, especially those living in development towns, became strained. Development towns became suppliers of cheap labor for industrial factories managed by neighboring kibbutzim. The kibbutzim were better organized, they had more political power and controlled more land than development towns. And those political and economic gaps caused conflict between kibbutzim and development towns. And this conflict was part of the larger ethnic rift between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim in Israel that was construed as a conflict between the privileged first Israel and the deprived second Israel. This rift originated in the 1950s, perhaps even earlier in the pre-state period, but it received serious public expression in the 1970s. This was largely due to the rise of the Israeli Black Panthers, which was a Mizrahi protest movement calling to end socio-ethnic discrimination. The mass demonstrations of this movement brought the Ashkenazi Mizrahi cleavage to the fore. There was protest even earlier, already in the 1950s and 1960s, but in the 1970s it became more significant. All those tensions found their way into the discourse of the terrorist attacks of the 1970s. We can see this in two articles that were published in the student journal of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The articles opposed the admiring tone in the reactions, in the public reactions to the event in Shamir, as I presented earlier. The articles hinted that the descriptions of heroism in Shamir and of helplessness in Ma'alot and Kiryat Shmona reflected cultural and ethnic stereotypes, but ignored the political and economic gaps between the communities. Now, let me share the screen again. The author of one of those articles wrote sarcastically, "The people of Ma'alot and Kiryat Shmona, as you can see here on the slide," he wrote, "are a bunch of cowards who need the IDF to protect them. To the people of Shamir, the handsome boys of First Israel, well done. The members of Shamir took up their weapons and fought independently without waiting for the IDF. When the Black Panthers of Kiryat Shmona and Ma'alot had fought independently for their right for equality vis-a-vis First Israel, they were called not nice." This is a reference to a statement by Prime Minister Golda Meir, who had said that the Black Panthers were not nice when she was talking about their protest, their activity a few years earlier. Continuing with the quote, "If the residents of Ma'alot and Kiryat Shmona also take up arms and demand that their towns receive the same subsidies that kibbutzim had received, the wheel of helplessness will be rolled back." So those articles made a clear connection between the treatment of the events in Shamir, Ma'alot, and Kiryat Shmona and the wider ethnic conflict in Israel. The articles implied that Shamir's people were described as heroes only because of their privileged status over residents of development towns. The article that I quoted used the military discourse to hint at the possibility of a Mizrahi armed struggle against institutional discrimination. By doing so, the article integrated the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the ethnic conflict within Israel into one narrative. And those texts demonstrate how the Israeli-Palestinian clash brought up to the surface internal divisions within Israel instead of serving as a unifying force. The connection between the themes of security on the one hand and ethnic, social, and cultural issues on the other is evident also in other responses to the attacks in the 1970s. This is related to a renewed discourse that emerged following the attack on Shamir regarding civilian reaction to Palestinian terrorism. Based on the example of Shamir, military and political leaders and other commentators insisted that civilians living in border areas should be prepared to defend themselves independently without, instead of relying on the IDF. This idea was not completely new. It was widespread during the Yishuv period and in the 1950s, and it started to decline in the 1960s with the growing reliance on the powerful IDF. My claim is that following the disappointment at the performance of the army of the IDF in the early phases of the Yom Kippur War, the terrorist attacks that came after the war, and the example set by Shamir, the idea of civilian self-reliance in the face of terrorism was revived. But now it was formulated in a way that drew a clear connection between self-defense and the values of the Israeli labor movement, and especially the kibbutz movement. This connection was evident in letters that Israeli citizens, most of whom were kibbutz members or people affiliated with the labor movement, sent to Shamir following the attack. One letter that reflected the tone of other letters as well stated, "Only your way of life, namely the kibbutz way of life, prevents the terrorists from executing their evil plans." Other letters connected the reaction of Shamir's members to the attack with themes that were traditionally associated and identified with labor and kibbutz culture, including strong bond to the land, sacrifice for the national cause, and steadfastness in the face of military and other physical or mental challenges. Some commentators placed the events in Shamir in a larger context of heroic and violent events in Jewish and Zionist history. Meir Yaari was the leader of a kibbutz artzi, which was the specific kibbutz movement to which Shamir belonged. He glorified the members of Shamir by comparing them to the defenders of the settlement of Tel Chai. The battle in Tel Chai in 1920 is regarded as a symbol of the Zionist ethos of defense and pioneering. Yaari also compared the fighters in Shamir to the fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto, and to to Jews who defended their communities in the pogroms in Eastern Europe after the First World War, and also compared them to fighters in famous battles in the 1948 war. If some responses place the events in Shamir in the larger context of Jewish and Zionist heroism, others emphasize the uniqueness of the kibbutz movement in reacting successfully to military challenges. One writer in the in Al HaMishmar, which was the newspaper of Kibbutz Arati, this kibbutz movement, this newspaper wrote that the conduct of Shamir's members during the attack had again confirmed the importance of the kibbutz movement, which was the first to rid itself of the delusions of complacency and passivity and face the new reality. The most stark example of this thinking was a statement of one Shamir member who said that it was no surprise that previously the terrorists had chosen to attack vulnerable and panicked development towns, but in Shamir they encountered a different reality. Now, we should see the glorification of Shamir and of the kibbutz movement more generally in a wider historical political context. In the mid-1970s, the values and political power of the labor movement, of the Israeli labor movement, were in a process of decline. This process accelerated following the devastation of the 1973 war and culminated in the elections of 1977, when the Labour Party, which had dominated Zionist politics since the 1970s, was for the first time defeated by the Likud party in the elections of 1977. So there was a process of decline of labor Zionism. The status of the kibbutz, which was a central institution of the labor movement, had begun to erode as early as 1948, when volunteering missions that kibbutzim had fulfilled in the pre-state period were now taken by the state after the creation of the state. The kibbutz movement maintained some of its prestige into the period following the creation of Israel in 1948, but in the early 1970s, there was a growing recognition that the kibbutzim had moved away from their idealistic pioneering image and started to lose their status in Israeli society. Against this background, the emphasis on the values of the kibbutz as part of the discourse on security following the attack on Shamir seems like an attempt to cling to a dying glory and revive a vanishing world. The public discussion focused not only on the military reactions to terrorism, but also on the atmosphere in the affected communities after the attacks. Reports on Shamir emphasized the silence that descended on the kibbutz, the silence in the kibbutz after the attack, and the strength and self-restraint that the community had displayed. One expression of this idea was expression appeared in a report in Yediot Achronot, the newspaper Yediot Achronot, that stated, Shamir is as strong as a rock. Now, we should understand that the silence and emotional restraint in the face of trauma were part of the ethos of labor Zionism since the days of the Yishuv, and later played an important role in shaping Israeli culture, especially in molding the image of the Israeli soldier. But in the historical context of the terrorist attacks of the 1970s, references to the silence in Shamir also had an important additional comparative dimension. Reports on Kiryat Shmona and Ma'alot emphasized the unrest in those towns after the attacks. Sharing my screen again. There were reports on outbursts of anger in the funerals of victims of the attacks, including attempts to physically attack government representatives who came to participate in the funerals in Tzfat and in other places. There were also reports on demonstrations of residents of Kiryat Shmona and Ma'alot near the Knesset, the Israeli parliament building in Jerusalem. The demonstrations combined expressions of fear and concerns over lack of security with complaints about the general living conditions in the two towns, in Ma'alot and Kiryat Shmona. Here we can see an example of one of those articles. You see the title, "The Ground is Shaking in Ma'alot." This is a picture from the funeral in Kiryat Shmona. The sign that the people here are all holding, I think, speaks for itself. It says, "Mr. Dayan, Defense Minister, why won't you leave here?" So this is an expression of a protest during the funeral in Kiryat Shmona. Another illustration of the link between the security problem and the larger socio-economic issue was the participation of a group of Black Panthers in one of the demonstrations in Jerusalem. Commentators who visited Kiryat Shmona and Ma'alot related the tense atmosphere in those towns following the attacks to deeper feelings of outrage over years-long discrimination. One writer observed that the attack on Ma'alot had broken the veils of security, not only the tangible, but also the mental ones. Everything that had been hidden and steering underneath overflowed and burst in a powerful flow onto the trembling ground. This discourse also included racist undertones. A writer in Ma'ariv described the rioters in one of the funerals as savages of the desert. He wrote that this behavior was a manifestation of what he called the spirit of the Orient, which was characterized, according to this writer, not only by beauty and wisdom, but also by lack of self-restraint. And I think here it's hard to ignore the comparison to the reports on silence and self-restraint in Shamir after the attack. Those comments demonstrate again how terrorism exposed deeper social and ethnic tensions. The attacks on Ma'alot and Kiryat Shmona also created tensions between Jews and Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. Arabs from Tarshiha did not come to their workplaces in Ma'alot during the week or 10 days following the attack. In the negotiations between leaders of the two communities, the Jewish and Arab communities in Ma'alot, Jews accused Arabs from Tarshiha of collaborating with the terrorists. Residents of Kiryat Shmona attacked Druze people. To prevent escalation, Druze in neighboring communities were banned from Kiryat Shmona for at least 1 week after the terrorist attack. The most extreme example of response The most extreme response to a Palestinian attack during that year was in the town of Beit She'an near the Israeli-Jordanian border. In November 1974, terrorists penetrated an apartment building in the town of Beit She'an and killed 4 Israeli citizens. After an IDF unit had killed a terrorist in one of the apartments on the second floor of the building, several Beit She'an residents entered the apartment and threw the bodies of the terrorists out the window. Other locals who had gathered around the building mutilated the bodies and burned them in a bonfire. They did not notice that one of the bodies was of an Israeli victim of the attack. The security forces were later ordered to remove all the Arabs from Beit She'an in order to prevent clashes with locals. Responses to the events at Beit She'an also included references to ethnic and social issues. One Israeli newspaper, citing the police commissioner, implied that the violence of Beit She'an residents was somehow connected to the Mizrahi protest and to the differences in norms of behavior between different population groups in Israel. An American Jewish newspaper suggested, quite strangely, that the burning of the bodies in Beit She'an may have been the result of frustration of Mizrahi Jews over the lack of acknowledgement of their forced departure from Arab countries in the 1950s and 1960s. The reports on steadfastness in Shamir and on fear, frustration, and anger in Beit She'an, Ma'alot, and Kiryat Shmona did not provide a completely authentic description of the differences in the reactions of those communities. Conversations with children in Shamir, one year after the attack, and recent testimonies of kibbutz members naturally revealed the feelings of fear that had not appeared in the more public pronouncements immediately after the attack. And of course, not all residents of the other communities participated in the more angry and violent responses. But the fact that newspapers and other contemporary sources prefer to highlight the differences indicates that the public images of the development town and the kibbutz shaped the discourse on terrorism. To conclude, with a few exceptions, existing scholarship tends to speak of the unifying effect of terrorism on Israeli society. This is part of a larger view that emphasizes what is called the rally around the flag syndrome, whereby terrorist attacks, not only in Israel, are followed by a rise in patriotic sentiment and in-group cohesiveness. In scholarship on Israel, particularly, there is a widely held assumption that external threats, such as war and terrorism, serve as a social glue holding together a deeply divided Israeli society. But, as I tried to show in this lecture, the discourse on civilian reactions to terrorism in the 1970s was intertwined with the ethnic and class divisions of the time. The public perceptions of the differences between the unfolding of the events in the communities hit by terrorism illustrate that Palestinian violence in the 1970s has exposed and accentuated social divisions in Israel. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Yehudai. That was an incredibly interesting talk and a wonderfully innovative and fascinating thesis that I think you've given us all a lot to think over. So I have many questions, but as is traditional, we'll start with the chat and with our own Eva Gurovich, who's a Schottenstein Fellow as well. And she wants to ask, do you think that the narratives that you've talked about, the narratives between these different communities were shaped specifically, or how were these narratives shaped specifically to the Israeli context of post-1967 Israel?
Well, I think the more relevant context is the post-1973 context. I mean, because the the atmosphere in Israel, the national atmosphere, the attitude towards the army, towards security, towards questions of security, and also social issues changed from after 1973 war. We know that the period after 1967 is regarded as the period of euphoria following the brilliant victory in the war. But then there was a crisis with after the 1973 war, especially because of the very difficult days at the early phases of the war, when there was a loss of trust in the leadership, in the political and military leadership, and also there was a protest movement against the government following the war. There were war veterans who accused the government of not preparing Israel for the war, of the bad conduct during the war. This actually developed into a significant protest movement, which compelled Prime Minister Golda Meir to resign in April 1974. And then one of the things that I show in this research is that this protest over security issues, not only after the war, but also in connection to the terrorist attacks, was connected to the social protests, many of Mizrahi Jews. The Black Panthers movement actually started their demonstration, their protest earlier. Their activities actually declined a little bit in 1973, 1974. But still, the social activism, especially Mizrahi protests against discrimination, was intertwined with the protest over security issues after the 1973 war, and then also in relation to the terrorist attacks after the war in 1974. So there is a transition here from the atmosphere of euphoria, national euphoria after the victory of 1967, to a more pessimistic atmosphere, to a sense of crisis after the 1973 war, which was, and again, in which the social issues were connected to security, military questions.
Thank you for that. Shana Weiss wants to know: do you see any of these? Do you see any resonance in Israeli society today? So she's thinking particularly of attacks that focus exclusively on Orthodox victims, for example, like in Har Nof.
I'm not sure I understood the question. Could you please try and repeat it?
Sure. Do you see any resonance in the divisions of Israeli society today? For example, attacks that might exclusively focus on particular segments of society. For example, attacks on Orthodox victims only. Are there any sort of reflections of the divisions that plague Israeli society today?
Yeah, I do think we can still see this today. For example, missile attacks from Gaza, from the Gaza Strip, on communities near the border with Gaza. So there have been complaints that Israelis living in the most central areas do not show express solidarity with communities in the south, which were targeted by attacks from Gaza. Of course, recently we saw that the Hamas also their missiles also reached Tel Aviv, so this changed the story a little bit. But generally, I think there is. I mean, the ultra-Orthodox communities. I'm not sure if they're. I can't remember specific cases where ultra-Orthodox people or residents were attacked, and there was an issue with the response of the rest of Israeli society, but I think that generally there have been cases. There have been cases when different communities reacted differently or were affected differently by security threats. And well, I think the example of the South is relevant here. Also, maybe in the second Intifada, when certain areas were more vulnerable than others, there was also debate about whether the rest of Israeli society really shows empathy and solidarity with those who were more vulnerable than others.
Thank you. And we have another question here that asks: can you say a little bit more, talk a little bit more about the non-military responses in either development towns or the kibbutzes that you mentioned in your research to the Arab or Druze communities that you cited?
So the non-military, yeah. So as I said, there was a sort of a grassroots maybe, or more a spontaneous reaction against Arabs in Israel. One of, as I said, the most extreme example was the burning of the bodies of terrorists in Beit She'an, but then also verbal attacks and even some cases of physical violent attacks against Palestinian citizens, against Druze in the north near Kiryat Shmona. There were also calls for revenge against Palestinians in Lebanon or in other places outside of Israel, as well as revenge against Palestinians in Israel. And I think that generally there was a process that one contemporary observer, someone who wrote in one of the newspapers, described as brutalization of Israeli society as a result of the attacks. This included, for example, calls for death penalty for terrorists. So there was a very intense debate in the media, in the newspapers, about whether Israel should introduce or should implement death penalty against terrorists. There were also suggestions that every time that in the next time that there would be such a hostage crisis, Israel should start executing Palestinian prisoners until the terrorists would give up their demand. There was also another interesting example of an attempt to create a unit, not an army unit, an unofficial unit of former soldiers who would also mount revenge attacks or preventive attacks against Palestinians in other outside the borders of Israel. There were, in the public discussion, there were a lot of comparisons. Many people compared the Palestinian terrorists to Nazis. This became very prevalent in the public discussion. Discussion of Palestinians as beasts, as Nazis. So general process of brutalization, of course, as a response to this, to this very brutal and cruel attacks, including on children. So this was, I'm trying to just an attempt to summarize the non-military responses. Yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering, you talked a little bit about how the events of Kibbutz Shamir were sort of mythologized in your youth, and you heard the stories of it over and over. And I was wondering, in the course of this research, what it was like to sort of unmythologize it, to study it from an objective perspective. What was that process like? And did you discover things that really had countered an image that you were brought up with your life, and anything that might have surprised you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because it's different from from other projects that I had did in the past, because of course of my personal involvement in the story. So as you said, this was a kind of a mythical event in our consciousness as people living in Shamir. There was a combination of tragic and heroic components of the story. Heroic, of course, because of the reactions of those fighters, and tragic because of the death of the three women. One of them was a member of the founding generation of the kibbutz. She was 58 during the attack when she died. Another was 28 years old, and she was pregnant when she was killed. And the third was actually a volunteer who came to work in the kibbutz about 2 weeks before the attack. She was 19 years old. She came from New Zealand, and she found herself, involved in this conflict. So there was always this tension between the heroic and the tragic consequences. But what was interesting was to learn about the sense of fear and trauma that many people in Shamir had felt during the event. I did a conversation, sort of a Zoom conversation with the kibbutz community when I was doing this research, and there was a very interesting conversation in which many people, some people actually even complained that the kibbutz had not dealt properly with the more emotional aspect of the story. People who were children at the time of the attack said that they had fears and they had trouble going to sleep, going to bed. So, and there was a discussion about how this was related to the more general cultural themes that I described earlier about the desire to show strength and steadfastness instead of expressing emotions and dealing with those fears. This was something that quite surprising to me to hear all those comments from people almost 50 years after the event. Yeah, this was very interesting and a meaningful things that I learned about the experiences of members of the community and how the community dealt with the trauma.
Fascinating. I was wondering, the comments you mentioned from Chaim Guri, they sort of reminded me a lot about the dichotomy between sort of the idea of the new Israelis and the Jews coming from Europe after the Holocaust, and that's sort of the idea of trying to create a new image of what Jews were and what Judaism was. And do you see sort of a reflection of that idea in the juxtaposition between the responses of Shamir and Ma'alot or Kiryat Shmona?
Yeah, so you mean then the effort to create a new type of Jew, a new image of Jewish men and women? Yes, I mean I think that the descriptions of what happened in Shamir, the glorification of Shamir, the reactions to Shamir, fit into this effort to create a new type of Jewish, the new type of Jewish men and women. This was part of the cultural aspects of Zionism, to create people who would be strong, proud, capable of defending themselves, as opposed to the image of the diaspora Jews as weak people who were victims of non-Jewish violence. There was also this sense of notion of connection to the land in Israel of those new Jews, new Zionist Jews, and kibbutzniks in general were sort of the central figure or a very dominant figure in this concept of the new Jew. And I think that the descriptions or reactions to what happened in Shamir played on those themes. Again, this was an attempt to revive this discourse, which was in the process of decline. During those years, there were other groups that became more prominent that were not part of the of this social circles and political circles of labor Zionism. So maybe the responses to Shamir were sort of an attempt to revive this discourse, not only on security, but also on this the cultural aspect. It's this conception of the new Jew, which played such an important role in Zionist culture.
Why is it, do you think, that it wasn't successful? The idea of the sort of trying to regenerate the kibbutz movement through these examples of Shamir didn't actually have a lasting effect.
Because the opposing forces were stronger. The kibbutzim, I mean, as I said, the process of decline in the status of the kibbutzim had started even in 1948, gradually progressed. But the most significant changes came later in the 1980s, 1990s, when most kibbutzim abandoned their socialist ideology and collective way of life. There were various reasons for that. This could actually also be seen as part of a larger global process of the decline of socialism and communism, right, in Eastern Europe around the same period. But there were also economic reasons. People in the kibbutzim themselves realized that the system was no longer sustainable economically. There was a growing influence of capitalism, of lifestyle of communities outside the kibbutz. So many people were leaving the kibbutzim, and there was a growing sense that the system should be changed. That it was no longer possible to sustain it. there was a debate about it. Of course, in the kibbutzim, there were people who wanted to maintain the old system. Already in the 1970s, there was a debate in the press where some people came out and spoke against the kibbutz ideology. People from the kibbutzim themselves, from within the kibbutzim, they said that this was no longer working, and then other people tried to provide the counter arguments about how important the kibbutz system was, and I think the discourse on terrorism and what had happened in Shamir around the same period was part of that. Again, the attempt to the glorification of Shamir was part of the attempt to argue that to show people that kibbutz values are still important, at least in the sense that they can deal with security threats.
Thank you. On its face, the subject of your new research seems quite different from your last book, but are there perhaps parallels that we're not seeing, or through lines from your research that you can expand upon?
Well, I think maybe the things that we discussed, that we talked about, this notion of the more cultural aspects of the Zionist project, the idea of the new Jew, and the expectations of how people in Israel should behave, should conduct themselves, the demand for patriotism and sacrifice for the nation. So my book was about immigration, Jewish immigration from Israel. So this was a story of people going against the mainstream, against the idea, the demand that Jews should live in Israel, which was the only national home for the Jews, and they were treated as traitors because they betrayed this idea. They wanted to live in other places. So the discourse around immigration also focused a lot on those on the image of the new Jew, the attempt to create this new rooted Jew as opposed to the wandering Jew of the diaspora. So yeah, I guess I'm interested in those questions, and they reappear in this research in a different context. This discussion of the attempt to shape a certain type of Jewish people, men and women, as part of the Zionist project.
Thank you very much. And I think I have one more question for you, if you don't mind. But I was wondering, your last work was very much focused on archival research, and this one you talked a little bit about how you actually had conversations with people who were on the kibbutz at that time. And I was wondering if your research remains archival, or what how you've gone about working on this project.
Yeah, it's a combination of various different sources. I use archival research, the local archive of the kibbutz, and also want to visit the archives of Ma'alot and Kiryat Shmona and other places. Also the archives, the Israeli state archives, and materials from from newspapers, from the press. But here I also because it's more recent than my previous research, which was about the 1940s, 1950s. This is in the 1970s, so I'm able to speak with people who actually participated in the event. As far as Shamir is concerned, I also personally I know these people personally. So I did interviews with some people, which was quite interesting. I mean, it's interesting to see how people reflect on those events. So it's another an additional dimension to my research, using those oral history interviews.
Well, Professor Yehudai, thank you so much for your time and for this absolutely fascinating talk. I know that I'm really looking forward to seeing the culmination of this project. Thank you everyone for joining us. Please join us for our next seminar on February 17th, where Professor Avraham of Ben-Gurion University will be giving a talk on the history of weed culture in Palestine and Israel, ethnic, class, and gendered perspectives. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for your questions, or for facilitating the discussion. Thank you.